Good morning, everyone, and sorry that we are a bit late. I was waiting for our guest of honor in one hotel, and she was waiting for me in another. So that's why we are a little bit late. But now we're good to go, and I'm very happy to see you here this morning for this seminar on the protest potential in today's Russia. My name is Helge Blokkesrud, and I have the pleasure to chair this morning's session. What will be the societal response to Putin's war? Will there be public protests? These are questions that we have been asked ourselves and been asked by the press over and over again since the onset of the war in Ukraine and Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It soon became clear that the price that ordinary people would pay for participating in such protest would be exorbitantly high. And it also became clear that the regime was prepared to go further than any time before when it comes to quell all kinds of public protests in Russia. But what exactly is the protest potential in today's Russia? Will we see a mobilization? I think few people are as well positioned as our today's speaker to answer these questions. Regina Smith is a professor of political science at Indiana University, Bloomington, and she has been studying for a long time political participation and societal organization in authoritarian states, and in particular Russia. And her latest book that came out with Cambridge University Press in 2020, Elections, Protest and Authoritarian Regime Stability, Russia 2008-2020, explore regime-society interaction and authoritarian consolidation in Putin's Russia. Today's talk is part of the Legitrus seminar series. Legitrus, or values-based legitimation in authoritarian state, top-down versus bottom-up strategies, the case of Russia, or for short, Legitrus, is a project funded by the Research Council of Norway and coordinated by Professor Paul Kolstø at the University of Oslo, and a seminar series where we have biannual seminars here at NUPI discussing authoritarian legitimation. I should also mention that this event is going to be streamed live, and that if you want to revisit the discussion afterwards, you will find a tape version of the seminar at NUPI's YouTube channel. Regina will speak for some 35 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for a Q&A session afterwards. But without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Regina. Please.
Good morning to all of you. It's been already an eventful trip. Excuse please my informal attire. I got into Oslo yesterday. My bag stayed in Paris, so it's been a time. So I want to talk today about the exciting possibility that Legitrus offered me to think about protest in a different way using some political science tools. What it tells us about what was going on in Russia almost a year ago right now when the data was collected, and then how that informs what's happening now in the face of the war. So, Oh, there we go. Okay, so just you did a lovely introduction, but let me just say over the past decade, when I landed in Moscow in 2011, 2012, I really saw that something was profoundly different happening in Russia. And I had been in Russia at almost every election between 1991 and 2011. I think I missed just one of them. And when I arrived in 2011-12, what I found was something that was as sort of vibrant and electric around the election as it had been in 1991 when Boris Yeltsin was elected, and then also in 1993 after the coup and the December elections. And what really struck me was that Russian society had changed profoundly, and that our trope about no civil society in Russia was overblown or overstated. And I embarked on a series of projects to look at the evolution of civic capacity to organize. So that started in the book that linked elections and protest, went to look at varieties of Russian activism, a joint project that I'll talk about, some really interesting work on social response to the Moscow housing renovation project, and then this project, the Legit Rus project. So varieties of Russian activism is very relevant for this project. It was, here's a meme from Tatarstan about language politics. It looked at what we often call non-political protest and spontaneous organization within Russian society of non-political collective action. And we covered a whole bunch of issues. I'm sorry, not having it, here we go. Across a wide range, including neighborhood or town beautification programs that were organized and then led to NGO organization to help other groups get these presidential grants to mobilize, help for the disabled with the unity of activism in the Russian Orthodox Church, and then Jeremy Morris's work in the chapter on the organization of the food delivery folks during COVID and the role of left politics. So we looked at a whole range. Of my work in this volume was on Moscow housing. We had things on cultural innovation, but it defined for us this idea or this bifurcation that Russians often talk about between political protest, which is those that seek regime change or profound reform, challenge the regime in some way, and mobilization that has to do with services, which Russians call non-political protest. And it was in this area that we really saw a lot of activism. And so between this period, we were really seeing very, very significant change in the capacity of Russians to mobilize on the local level from below. And that raises a real challenge for what's happening in the war right now, in the Russian response to the war. So the Legit Rus project really gave me, and thank you so much for the invitation, to look at protest potential in a new way. So political scientists, if you are a fan of Levada polls, you know that they've been asking this question: if a protest were held in your town, would you participate this weekend? And you get really sort of consistently low 20% response rates. And as political scientists, we know these measures aren't very accurate because they don't deal with specific issues. Protest for what? Because I'm only going to protest if I care about the issue, and I'm only going to protest if the issue is relevant for my life. The other thing that we know is that the government in Russia aggressively intervenes in protest patterns by sanctioning or not sanctioning protest. So a sanctioned protest is when protesters either show up at one of these Hyde Park situations where it's legal to protest, or used to be, because even that's a problem now, or they petition local government for, it's not actually a permit, but a license, and they negotiate the number of folks that might show up at the protest and so on. And by labeling a protest unsanctioned, you're signaling that the police are likely to get involved, that there could be arrest and so on. And increasingly, very few protests are sanctioned, even on these non-political issues. And we're seeing a rise in the decline of the right to protest. And that happened before the Navalny protests in 2021, but it's gotten even stronger after that. So what this wonderful survey instrument allowed us to do was to ask about protest on a whole range of issues that are both political and non-political, and also on things that we might think of as government support, right? So if we look at the very far right of the screen here, we look at whether or not people might be moved to protest to support Russian values. And here, look at the high numbers we're getting in this time. And I believe these numbers, actually. When I first looked at them, I didn't quite believe them, but they're very consistent with other findings. So we've delved fairly deeply into these patterns, and we're seeing really, this, by the way, is sanctioned. I'm just showing you sanctioned now. So in a sanctioned protest, you get these really high issues. Notice that it falls off when we talk about things like election fraud. It falls off when we talk about protesting economic decline. Look at how high it is for accountability. So there's been an increase in people's willingness to contest failed policy promises. And then these other ones, environment, human rights, health and welfare in the middle of COVID, pensions, which people are still willing to protest about. And then notice how little spontaneous support there is, that people say they would turn out spontaneously to support the government. And that's about consistent with the vote, or the vote that we think United Russia actually got in the election, not the falsified level of results. So that result really reflects what we've seen in other public opinion polls. So when we are able to ask sanctioned, unsanctioned, or specific issues, we get a very different picture of the potential for activism. Now, this isn't activism, right? Protest is a rare event in any society, and in Russia, because there's so little actual civic organization, protest is also spontaneous. So usually it's led by seeing other people protest, as opposed to organizational mobilization. That, I think, has important implications for going forward. So what I did with those issues was run a factor analysis and take a look at which issues hung together. What I expected here was that there would be three dimensions of activism. Political activism, which would combine the economic decline, the election fraud, and government promises, and then the non-political protest. And what we see, quite surprisingly, by this period last year, 2021, is that non-political and political fall together in one dimension, which really speaks to an interesting level of attitude about protest being an important tool for political activism across a wide range of issues. And that actually really surprised me. And we see that those dimensions hold over, the second dimension is the pro-government dimension, Russian values and support for the government. And if you go over and you look at the unsanctioned, it's the same dimensions, except that even protesting conservative or traditional values, traditional Russian values, isn't supported in an unsanctioned protest. So even if it's considered government friendly, there's a more complicated story about what's happening with values and people's decisions to turn out. And I think that's a really important finding that I'm going to echo going forward, which is that what we think of traditional values is not divorced from political activism. So it's not that liberals protest and those who hold these values don't protest. In fact, they do. And the same is true of Putin supporters. So within that, Putin plays a very important role in the story I'll show in a second. But you really are seeing that some significant percent of people who support Putin also will turn out for these non-political protests. They're not turning out for the political, but they're turning out for the non-political. Okay, so here's just the proportion of people who would support all issues except support for the government, so things we usually think of activism, and then for government support, and these are, the left bar here are sanctioned events, and the right is unsanctioned events. I want to point out, okay, these are just percentages, right, so you can compare. First of all, look at how few people are saying don't know or not applicable. So really, people have made up their minds, at least within these data. People are not shy about saying that they would participate. The survey has another wonderful feature which talks about whether or not you support protest on that issue and if you would show up, right? So we can look at both things. So you see that if people don't support, they don't show up. That's good for us, right? But you also see here the effect of sanctioning, and sanctioning works in two different ways if you believe these data. The first is that it pushes people from saying they even support protest on the issue. So it sort of has a disengagement effect, what I'm calling a disengagement effect. If the protest isn't sanctioned, I'm not political, I don't do that kind of thing. If it's sanctioned, they're more likely to show up. And then it has a second effect that works on the people who do show up, which is a direct fear effect. So really this act of repression, of sanctioning or unsanctioning, has a very complex effect on people's attitudes. And one, I think, that we're seeing now as we've moved from repression being sanctioned or unsanctioned to really fairly draconian charges. And then I think, here, let me just go back, which is if you look at support for the government, there are more people who say that even in a sanction, they don't support or might not show up. And again, you see the percentage of people who would actually show up is really quite small. Okay, nonetheless, the difference between sanctioned and unsanctioned, it is statistically significant. That's what it's showing here. And it's showing you the percent of fall off on each one of the issues between a sanctioned and an unsanctioned protest. Notice the wide variance, right? We see really quite wide variance. One of the reasons that we see so little fall off on some of these issues is the number of people who would participate in those political events is also smaller, right? And so the drop off is smaller. But sanctioning is definitely a tool that the government uses to tamp down protest, and it's an effective tool. Although judging by these numbers, right, we're looking at between 15 and sometimes very small events, an increasingly not as effective tool as it once was. So Sam Green, I'll come back to this, but Sam Green has made this wonderful observation that I think is spot on, that there's a bright line effect happening here, that we see that people are, they go up to the line and they probe the state, they probe what the consequences are, and then they're willing to accept. And that we're seeing in these numbers that some people on the back of the Navalny protest really had probed that line and were willing to accept consequences. And then as consequences escalate, you have you establish a new equilibrium that takes some time. Okay, so what if we add values into the story? Well, I did the same thing, and I'm sure Paul and others, Helga, you've probably been looking at these variables too. What I did was take the questions that asked about these variables and ran the same sort of factor analysis to see what hung together. And you get a very interesting outcome. All of these factors hung together in one dimension. So there is a strong dimension of traditional values that combines family values, school children and education about protecting the homeland, and then orthodox values and the eternal strong leader question. So those hung together as a single strong dimension, although not everyone was high on every set of these issues. So the most common support came from these family type values. In economic times, jobs should go to men. Men make better leaders. Happy children need two parents. Here I'm paraphrasing the question. Marriage should be between a man and a woman. Another one that was common was patriotic education. So there was really high support for patriotic education. That foreshadows what's coming. Not so much support as much for the orthodox values and more support for the strong leader. So that leads to basically a scale, and here don't be nervous, you guys who know this data well. I inverted the scale so conservative is high, just because it was easier to present. So where the mean response, modal response is between 2.5 and 3, so it's a society that leans conservative. But notice it's, whereas on the political protest events, we do see some polarization, particularly around politics. Here on these traditional values, it's much more centrist, right, in this reading of these values. And there aren't many people who we would say are very purely conservative, about 25, and this comports to work like Paul Good has done about the internalization of the messages that come from the top. It's hard in this survey to say what this means because basically the question says, do you support, or how much support do you have, but not what the alternative is. So we didn't pin the alternative. And that's sort of an interesting way to ask the question, and I think shows us sort of a more spontaneous way of thinking about these values in everyday life. So if I didn't want to put up a lot of regression numbers, but if we run a logistic regression of individuals to try what factors really shape whether or not they would protest. Well, it turns out that these conservative values, because the scale is a little skewed, is actually a positive effect on these non-political protests. Not so much on political, but on non-political. Trust in Putin is a huge intermediary here, and I'm going to show this more clearly. So trust in Putin is pushes you away from protesting, more if it's sanctioned than unsanctioned. Younger people pushes you towards protesting. I think I have the wrong sign there. So if you're younger, you're more likely to protest. In these data, what's so interesting is in the post-Navalny time, university-educated people are not protesting or are less likely to protest. Young people are, but more well-educated people are not. And we'll have to probe that a little more, whether that's a middle-class kind of conception that matters, I think, now for the anti-war movement, whether it's disengagement. We have some work to do there. I have some work to do there. And here, for the first time, women are protesting more. And women aren't just protesting on these non-political lifestyle issues or saying they would protest, they're also participating in political protests around election fraud in support of Navalny, demanding economic response. This is important because in the anti-war movement, which we've been following through OVD Info and other sources, you do see many more women being arrested, more so than ever have been. So women, particularly young women, are mobilized now. And they're turning out. And there's a very nice report on OVD about the increase in women protesters. And we're seeing that not only in big cities, but even in smaller cities and regional capitals. So that's a really significant change. So here, I don't want to overwhelm you with just chart after chart, but here's on the health and welfare set of issues. As conservative values go from 0 to 5, you see this increase because people hold these family values. And you also see this is if you have low trust in Putin, you're more likely to protest even if it's unsanctioned. That's true of both these. But it's an important this is high trust in Putin. So even people who trust Putin are protesting. Well, what does that tell us? Putin's a really strong intermediary, but people are still protesting local and regional governments. That's what that's about. These are local and regional government types of actions, right? But you see that among those who don't trust Putin, you see very little difference between sanctioned and unsanctioned protest effect. And I think that that had to be worrying the government as it was looking. We know this is a government that polls effectively. It had to have been worrying the government to be seeing that 2 years before presidential elections. And I think that the struggle to win a majority in the supermajority in the 2021 election and the high cost of that victory really underscores that society was changing and the state was adapting in order to maintain its victories. So we see, again, election fraud. Here, values don't make as much difference as they make on the other kind. That's because on this one, you see most people who are protesting are a different kind of person, right, or are protesting election fraud. Here again, low trust in Putin is very tight. Even people who have high trust in Putin are willing to protest falsified elections. There's some learning happening. Some other work I'm doing about election fraud perception. There's an accumulation of understanding of election fraud that if people are thinking about Duma elections, for example, are willing to protest. So we see that happening. All right, what does this tell us about the war and the affect? If we see this sort of overwhelming propensity to express oneself on the streets, then what is it that we see? And if you want, we can talk about 2021, why we didn't see any protest after that election. I have some ideas about that. But why is it that we're not seeing more protests? Well, first of all, we did see quite a bit of protest very early on before we saw the government response. And here I think we're seeing the effect of repression, right? And we are seeing the effect of disengagement. I'm not political. It's not my war. I didn't start this war. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why this has changed. We are still seeing quite a bit of protest on the streets across Russia being manifested in various ways. So the protest capacity is still out there. One thing I want to say about the war is that much of the explanation for the war has to do with foreign policy itself. But I think if we want to talk about the timing of the war and the Kremlin's propensity to jump into war in a very misguided way with very poor assumptions, then I think we have to point to the fact that society is very restless, or was very restless. And that if the Kremlin did in fact believe that it would find no opposition or very little opposition in Ukraine, misguidedly believing that there would be no strong Western response, then this looked like a good pre-election strategy if it was going to be Crimea 2014 all over again, and would just sort of grease the wheels to presidential elections. And I think we have lost sight a little bit about the domestic sources of this foreign policy, if you can call it that. I'm sure you are engaged in, I am engaged in these debates over what is the true sentiment about the war. Margarita Savadskaya has a beautiful piece in Riddle that she wrote and then updated about why polls are so problematic now. One reason that polls are so problematic is because things are changing so rapidly, and I think we are seeing a rapid realization within Russian society. I'll talk a little bit about what I think that looks like and how it affects these data. But there's a clear, you probably have seen this report, this list experiment by Chepovsky and Schaub that was reported out of LSE, where if you ask the direct question about supporting the war, 70% of people, this was, I think, in the 5th week of the war, and if you ask it using a list experiment, that support goes down much less. So a list experiment is just a way of asking people how many things on the list they support without asking them to name them. So you can say you support something without naming it. And you see that the support goes down. There was a new paper out by Tim Fry and his cohort, Scott Gelbach, that showed that they've been using these list experiments to look at support for Putin. Is support for Putin real? They're now concluding that the list experiment is so muddy that they don't think it's really a great tool, that even the list experiments are overestimating support on sensitive issues. So that's reported at the Ponar's website. That's brand new work that's out. So what I want to say is that there are so many questions we have about these surveys and so little theory about how to correct or respond to these issues. For instance, response rates have now gotten very, very low. So, which means that people who are supporting the war are more likely to respond than people who are not. But we don't know what those proportions look like. So we're a little at a loss about judging what real sentiment is. The one thing I will say, and Levada had a poll out over the weekend you might have seen, we are seeing a serious trend of declining support. In Levada, that manifested as people less willing to say that they fully supported the war. So very few people were willing to say they fully supported, they only partially supported. And their concerns are now the length of time that the war is going on, and also the casualties. So we're seeing new concerns pop up in these polls. So while the numbers are very problematic, the trend speaks to growing discomfort. I'm not going to call it opposition yet, right? I don't think we know that. So how do we think about that? Well, just as in the polls I showed you, we're seeing a very strong Putin factor in these polls. So people who have high trust in Putin are also the people who are outright very strongly supporting the war. We see that going on. We also see that they are the people who are playing a blame game, right? So those are the people who are most likely to shift blame, to blame the West, or now we're starting to see blame of inadequate leadership, not Putin, right? So, but here the Putin factor is still very strong, and it's going to be hard for people to express dissatisfaction with the war if they also supported Putin. And we have to keep paying attention to that. One thing that I've seen that I think is really important in our story that is overlooked is that in my work for free elections, we asked people about the Arab Spring. And what we found out from those data is that citizens tend to use and trust state media more on foreign policy than on domestic issues. And I think we've sort of lost sight of the difference between foreign policy and domestic issues. They discount alternative sources, and they focus on blame attribution rather than factual events. So it's a different use of information and a psychological decision-making model, but it's also a different kind of a different reliance on state media. We found this really strongly, but subsequent other people have found the same kind of finding. And I think that's at play here. So can we really say that this is a rally around the flag that in some way wipes out pre-existing attitudes or discontent? And here I want to really kind of strongly plant the seed that I don't think we can say that this is a strong rally around the flag. So yes, as this really quite moving statue underscores, remembering World War II is extraordinarily important, right? And the pride of Russians in World War II is extraordinarily important. At the same time, there is increasing evidence that the regime's effort to pin this conflict into that same box, a fight against Nazism, a sort of valiant global fight, is not working. And we see this in several ways. Several groups of scholars are working on narratives. What kind of narratives are being expressed on state TV? And we're seeing a change in the narrative, a moving away from the Nazism narrative, which isn't playing well, towards the NATO threat, the US threat narrative, right? So we're seeing a change in narrative. I would say that we do see, as with lots of rally around the flag effects, a fairly rapid response. And that was good for the Kremlin when information sources were low. It locked in support for the special operation, I think still hoping that it would be quite short. And so there is some locked-in support that we're seeing. Information control is still quite effective. Building on narrative and identity, like patriotism and defense of the homeland, as in the legit Rus story, is important. What's really different is the emotion. Rally around the flag is usually a prideful kind of reaction. Here we are not seeing, as we did on 9/11 in the US, young men lining up to volunteer to protect the motherland. We're not seeing that sort of volunteerism. We have seen volunteerism in behalf of relatives in Ukraine. That's an untold story that I think we're going to hear more about within Russians, but we have not seen volunteerism around the war. What we really have seen is normalization of this experience that is now cracking. So we see a lot of anecdotal data and also polling data that talks about this. We've been through this before. We've been through this in Crimea. We survived sanctions before. We came out stronger. This is just more of the same. In a month or two, things will be back to normal. And the question we all need to be asking is, what really happens when it's clear that things aren't going to be back to normal? And I think if there's anything that's clear in this conflict, is that it's a new normal. And none of us, and I certainly don't pretend to think I know what that will look like. I think the other thing the regime has been very effective about, and these charts are hard to come by these days, right? So the immediate response was to cover the pocketbook information that people might get in their personal lives, transforming the foreign policy into domestic policy. So the regime's been quite good at tamping down inflation and also sustaining the price of the ruble at a very high economic cost. And as Nabulina reminded us last week, I'm losing track of time, 10 days ago or so, when she gave a report from the central bank wearing a brooch that was a cloud with raindrops falling from it, right, signaling to all of us that the outlook is poor, that Russia cannot keep intervening. that it will not be able, even with oil income, to keep sustaining, to prop up the economy in this way so that it does not become a domestic crisis. We see this happening in two ways. One way is that unemployment is rising as inputs in factories are falling, and factories are either resorting again to this practice of job sharing, although we haven't heard much of that, or people are being laid off. So we see this happening in interviews and in this kind of qualitative data. But we're also seeing inflation, particularly on foodstuffs, rise, and it's rising regionally at the moment. So I read reports yesterday that said that fruit and vegetable prices in Dagestan have gone up 30%, even higher in the Far East. So we're seeing this regional cost in places where we've already seen protest, right? That can't be something that feels comfortable to the Kremlin at this point. So for now, they've precluded making this foreign policy issue a domestic policy issue, and but that is not going to last much longer. And that's when I would expect to see more action. So what is happening now? I think we're seeing a Russian disengagement sort of dynamic, a repression disengagement. Repression's gone up. People are pulling back from politics for the moment. This is Green's theory, the red lines theory, an adjustment to periods of repression. We have seen an escalation now in this sort of infra-politics kind of protest. Jeremy Morris is very early on, I think, he spoke at Indiana on a panel. We did a big teach-in within 48 hours of the first tanks crossing the border. And Jeremy predicted this idea of defensive consolidation, that people wouldn't so much consolidate around defending the war, but consolidate around this grievance of Russia having been a target, always being a target, always being a victim, and engaging that. And he's doing some quite wonderful writing on his blog. If you don't read his blog, Post-Socialism, you should. He's doing some interviewing and keeping track. And then we see other people. Ulya Olnik is talking about preference falsification. Certainly there's some preference falsification in this work we're seeing. Cognitive dissonance, Negavaya, people are only taking in the information that confirms their previous thinking. There's another step in cognitive dissonance where that threshold becomes too high and you have to start to rationalize or bring that in. Here's a place where some new theoretic work is going to be important to us on disinformation and the collapse of narrative, how narratives collapse. And then we're going back to the things that Catherine Verdery or Lev Gudkov talked about. Gulnaz Sharafudinovna, also part of this project, talks about learned helplessness and the social desirability bias. So these ideas are collectively constructed. They are not individually constructed. And change is going to happen the same way change has always happened in Russia, at the kitchen table through kitchen talk. We're back in a kitchen talk kind of atmosphere as real information filters into the population. So I think I'm done. That was my last slide. Let me just say, all of this is in no way to justify or be an apologist for Russian opinion. I myself mistakenly went with most of my Russian colleagues saying that I didn't predict the war because I was put on the spot a lot on this, predicted that all of what has happened would happen, right? That the Ukrainians would unite, that the fight would be strong, that the war wouldn't be easy, that the West would respond. And I assumed that President Putin also had that information and cautiously would not go in. And I was wrong. And so I think again, Sam Green wrote this, our head is in Putin's head. But I do think that Russians now face not only a decision about incorporating new information and shifting blame, it is a moral problem, and it is an infinite uncertainty problem. And here we're on shaky ground theoretically about how things will change. And I think it's also a really fascinating challenge for us as social scientists to think about it more systematically. So I'll stop there.
Let's see. Quickly rearrange the scene.
Thank you.
We were many who were wrong about the war, so you were definitely not alone there. And I think there will be a lot of questions relating to disengagement and engagement related to the war from the audience here. We have a very knowledgeable audience, but I would just like to start by asking a question that you hinted to yourself during your presentation about the elections in 2021 and why there were no protests then. We had seen the Navalny protests early on, and then came the elections, and they were clearly falsified, but no great public reaction to that. So you said you could explain that, or that you had some theories.
Well,
so
I have a theory.
let's start with that, and then we'll also open the floor for questions while Regina addresses that.
So I think that the my book model would predict that the protests in 2021 and the state response to those protests basically convinced people that the state would do anything to win that election, and that contesting it was pointless. And so that the point at which that election was decided was actually on the streets, when the protests stopped in response to state violence. And I do think that a really important, and we saw quite a bit of disengagement around the 2021 election in the polls, and that we're going to see some fascinating and great work come out of the Russian election study. We're already seeing pieces of it come. But I think that the election was over when the state increased repression in the spring of 2021, and that elections and protest had become very linked by that point, and that people who otherwise might have protest disengaged. I place less stock. I think the Navalny team is very important for sparking protest, but I don't think particularly the decapitation was the point here. I think the point was that the engaged community was disengaged. So yes, of course, they are the vanguard. Yes, of course, they go out. But the people right behind them also were very discouraged, right, who are unorganized. These are the people involved in the internet, denizens, and people in talk. So that would be my response to that.
Okay, we'll start with a question from Paul. You please use the mic, and please also introduce yourself, even if we know you.
Nice to have you here, and very nice to see that you got so much out of our survey. So I have a few comments and questions. First, I found this list experiments very interesting and intriguing, but I think not everybody in the audience understands what that is. So if you could explain that. And also, I'm not sure if I understood the red line theory, if you can explain that also. When it comes to your first charts, you had a category called support willingness to participate in unauthorized protests in favor of the government. Why shouldn't? What kind of category should that be? I mean, should the government deny sanction of a rally in support? And finally. You on the first chart, I think it was, you showed that there was strong support for participating in protests to hold the government accountable, and much lower for against election fraud. But can't you say that to hold fair and free elections is a government promise, and they break that? So that could be a sort of just a subgroup of holding the government accountable.
Thanks. So, so the list experiment was actually sort of originated by some of my colleagues in Indiana University to talk about sensitive issues in surveys. So the idea is that you ask people two separate questions. On the first question, you ask them, how many of these issues do you support? You split your sample. How many of these issues do you support? And then you ask the same question of a mirror sample within your sample, but you add the sensitive question on the bottom, and you look at the difference in the percentage of support across those two subgroups, right? And the idea is that you can say, I do not, in this case you would ask, what don't you support? You can say, I do not support this war without saying the word war, or even revealing that that's the thing you're pointing to. So that's how it works. I mentioned this, they've been, Fry and his team from ICSID have been using this to talk about Putin's popularity for quite a long time. They have a wonderful discussion of how they've been using it over time and what the problems are that can go wrong in this short paper they have at Ponar. So we're using a similar list experiment to talk about protest in Kazakhstan now. So we're designing a similar kind of event. So Sam, Sam can speak for himself, and he does also beautifully in his own blog, which I, really think people should be following. But I think he's correct about this. We've seen this in other places. When there are new repressive actions, there's an immediate fall off in societal mobilization and response until people start probing how the police are going to respond in their locality. So again, in a large federal state like Russia, how the law is implemented is as important as the law itself. If you look at OVID info reporting about war protests, for example, there is some significant, or it appears to be, we're working on this, some significant variation in how regions are responding. So what people are being charged with, for example. There's a whole range of charges that people can be charged with, and some regions are not charging people with the most draconian. That's quite rare up until now. Also, whether they're arrested and then let go, these kinds of things are varying by region. So I think that's what Sam means. You probe the line, you see how it's going to affect yourself and your future. If your university is going to push you out, as they have at St. Petersburg State and other places, and then when they have a better picture of the consequences, they're more likely to go out. Right. So I think that's the argument he's making, and I think he's right about that. So you asked me about, sanctioned, unsanctioned, and support of the government. I think what's interesting is that what it reveals is something I saw in earlier work that I did about protest. And when my book work looks not only at protesters, but those who attended Putin rallies. And what we found is the fear of police in Putin rallies was as high or higher than fear of police in the protests. And the police presence was as big or as strong. So I think there are several things going on that really need to be unpacked. One is, I think that the government sometimes, especially in the regions, because let me link this to your other question about accountability. Accountability is at all levels of government. And I think what we're seeing is response to, would you protest against your mayor or your regional or city manager? Or would you protest against your governor or your Raisoviet, which I now know we call something else, but I'm stuck in Raisoviet. So we're seeing local. So when you ask about election fraud, that's usually a national issue. And that's the line, I think, right? So I think there are some places where a rally in favor of the government seems dangerous, sometimes because, as happened to ex-President Trump in Pennsylvania over the weekend, people just don't come, right? So, and we've been seeing a lot of pro-war rallies where people just don't come. But so it's a little bit dangerous, but I think mostly it's an artifact of the way the survey was structured and this splitting into two samples. But I do think it underscores the fear of police within the non-pro survey. Those are the law and order people, right? The people who trust Putin are the people who want, their version of law and order, which is lawless.
I have a long list of people now, but
Okay.
And
I'll be short.
next, but I will just wonder if you could say very briefly a little bit more about what you said about the regional pattern of how the authorities are responding to protests, because it's a regional variation. Are there some patterns here? Are they more strict in places where you traditionally will see mobilization, like Moscow, St. Petersburg, or what can you tell us about regional variation in the response?
So I want to be really cautious because we've just launched this project. But yes, we are seeing more charging in larger cities. We are seeing more aggressive action against students in larger cities. But it varies, and this is why I don't want to go too far. It varies rayon by rayon. So these are very individual level decisions that are being made by police precinct captains and also by courts. So I hope that pretty soon we'll have a better picture of that. But if you just even go to OVD.info and you start reading the reports, you'll see there's quite a big regional variation that isn't only the number of people protesting.
So, and you'll get the microphone here.
Thank you. I think you summed up your presentation by saying that we have now a new normal in Russia with regard to the protest potential. I have one comment, and I'll illustrate them with two questions. My comment is that, is this really a new normal? Isn't it rather to the contrary, Russia reverting to form historically and psychologically? And my questions will be, first of all, with regard to you noted that there are quite a few people who would support Putin, but at the same time they participate in protest. That is a traditional Russian phenomenon. We have always seen the notion among most Russians that they have this good Tsar, but the evil chinovniks, his officials, who suppress popular will against the will of the Tsar. So I think this is what we see reappearing. I would like to ask if you agree with me there. And the second question concerns what you say about the focus on blame attribution, which we see now. Isn't that also a traditional Russian phenomenon? You have the perennial questions in Russia, кто кого, кто виноват, что делать? And the second of these, of course, is who is the guilty party, who is to blame. So whenever there is a problem of great magnitude, the focus always, let's say, the various focuses converge on the question of who is to blame. Thank you.
Thank you. Is the new normal the old normal?
Is the new normal the Soviet normal,
Yes.
right? Is the new normal yes. So do I agree or disagree? I have a hard time agreeing. I think that the change in Russian society, at least among a big part of Russian society, was significant. I think it's very hard to put all of that back into the box and wipe that out. But I also agree that there's a before and after the war kind of analysis. Do I think that, and here it's, we're speculating, right? It's hard for us to falsify our theories without time. We need some time. Did I think, given the work I had done, that we would see protests? I did, and there was protest. Do I think that this draconian response to that protest breeds new problems for this government? I absolutely do. Do I think that, and here I'm going to go way out on my limb, which we can saw off later, that is it going to activate new kinds of protests, labor protests, for example? Are we going to see somewhere down the road a meeting of political and economic protests, which we have not really seen very largely in Russia? If economic conditions get bad enough, I think that it's possible. I think that it's also possible that we will see, and I've realized, given the militarized nature of police, how speculative this is, that we will see police stop enforcing some of these rules in some cities, which is going to cause some problems. And here, again, this is why we're engaged in this regional variation, to get a sense of it. But nonetheless, I was surprised at the disengagement. It's hard to predict. I think disengagement is a halfway house, whether it pushes people towards what you're arguing, what Jeremy Morris is arguing. I think Jeremy's watching. I wish he could be here with us. Is this defensive? If it pushes them towards a defensive consolidation stance, or produces some, I don't know what word to use here, courage, sanity, morality that says, this government is not acting on my behalf. And yes, certainly the Putin administration has gone back to deflection of blame. This is the modus operandi of this regime, and it's done it extraordinarily effectively. You've shown that in your work with regions, right? So is he going to be able to fire some military and security officers and say they are the guilty? I don't know how long that will go when the true nature, it's hard for me to imagine that when the true nature of this military calamity, the lack of preparedness, the lack of functioning of this military is clear to people, when it is undeniable, that people will stay where you see them. But I may be wrong. We will know with time.
Next on my list is Daniela Slavinsky, who works on regional protest in Arkhangelsk.
Hi, yes, and thank you for introducing me, Helge. Okay, so I have a very global, overarching question related to what kind of information we can get from studying protests in Russia and protests and Russian protest potential. And especially in these times, we are, of course, very interested in learning more about whether the lack of mass mobilization against the Ukrainian war, what does it tell us?
Putin's war against Ukraine,
yes,
not the Ukrainian war.
It's a better term, I agree. And then comes the question of, I'm interested in the boundary between political and non-political protests. Working on studying the Shias protests in Arkhangelsk, I found it incredibly difficult. And I see that it was used throughout your presentation, these two categories. And I mean, what we usually term political in the West is not necessarily so or non-political is not necessarily so in Russia. And here we might also see how the regime defines what is political and not political. So, I mean, how do you draw the boundary? And also, you mentioned disengagement. And what are your thoughts on what causes disengagement? And would you say that it shows the power of narratives in Russia, and how? Thank you.
Okay, so those are a lot of small questions that I'll try to answer. So I think what we see in these questions about protest potential is discontent. So it's a measure of discontent. I also think that, and I alluded to this, but I'll say it more strongly, we are in a phase in these authoritarian cases of an information cascade kind of protest model, where the more people who go to the streets, the more people will join them. And so there is a small vanguard of people who exists out there who are strongly against the war. If we look at this list experiment, it's easy to focus on the fact that 53% of the people support the war. But we're missing the fact that 47% do not. And you don't need 40% of Russians on the streets to affect change. And I think we forget that sometimes. Moscow's a city of 16 million, probably more like 20 non-officially. How many people need to go to the streets to affect a serious crisis? Well, probably about 1 million, right? And so I think that's always an important. So this is a measure of disengagement, of disaffection, of dissatisfaction across a wide range of issues that link political and non-political, and I think that's important. So political and non-political is not my term. As a political scientist, I am struggling. Exactly, I am a Duke-trained political scientist. I don't like this because these are definitely political actions that people are taking, but they themselves make that distinction. It's the language they use to distinguish between making demands that can be achieved within the system and making demands that have to be achieved by political change. You saw this, and you said about, can the even if people didn't like Navalny personally, or maybe were skeptical about him, they really liked his philosophy, and they liked his organization, and they liked the way he ran his campaign in Moscow. They liked the effect of smart vote in the cities where it had an effect. And so while Navalny personally was unpopular, the sort of actions he was taking were not unpopular. And often in this campaign in 2018 to use the presidential election to mobilize, and also in the deep study that I did of his campaign in 2013, most of the people who came out to volunteer didn't like Navalny, or at least said they were not Navalny supporters, but they liked the way he did things, and they agreed that this was a step forward. And so I think that we sometimes overstate what is radical and what isn't radical. And if there's a lot of pent-up demand around a lot of issues, a lot of dissatisfaction, then I think it can transcend issues. Certainly this information cascade was at work in the For Free Elections protests, and it was at work in the cascade of For Fair Elections in 2011-12 into the regions, right? It's probably not satisfying. I mean, the subtext is the war too political for this kind of information cascade to work? Let me make this very speculative argument. When was it that Dan Treisman and his co-author called Russia a normal country to great disdain or dismay? That Russia was just a normal, albeit developing world kind of country akin to Brazil. Well, what's been revealed to us is that it was not. The corruption level within military preparedness was much higher than we ever thought it possibly could be. But Russians themselves have become accustomed to thinking of Russia as a normal country. What's happening in Russia is not normal. And that's what I think the information cascade is about. That people, and also about disengagement, people are uncomfortable. It's very difficult to see this as normal. Jeremy's right, some people are gonna go to this defensive consolidation, but I think just as many and probably more will say, we really thought we were a normal country. And I think that's a very dangerous moment. And I wish we were asking that question, right? Political scientists get stuck in comparability. We want to ask questions where we can look over time and see what's happening. But I think our questions got out of touch with what was actually happening in the country. And I think this is a shame. And I think we need to ask questions about, do you think Russia's a normal country? We need to do focus groups on what normal means. Right, but I just want to say this is not a normal foreign policy. This is, and I think people are very comfortable, or I think that Russians are grappling with this move into the immoral and the abnormal.
Next question, Tamta.
Hi, Tamta Gelashvili. I'm a research assistant at NUPI and a PhD candidate at the University of Oslo. Thank you, first of all, for a very fascinating presentation, and also the discussion, very informative. My first question was very similar to Daniela's, but thank you for a very comprehensive answer to that about the distinction between political and non-political. But my second question was, you mentioned something about collapse of narratives, and you mentioned this in the context of the claim about denazification being abandoned or a bit switched to the blame game about the US and the NATO being a threat. And I was wondering if you could theorize a bit on what the reason to that could have been and why this narrative was not as successful as it was intended to be. Thank you.
So I'm doing a lot of speculation here.
Please.
So first of all, let me recommend the work that Paul Good is doing, tracking narratives. He's doing a really wonderful job tracking media narratives and the rise and fall of narratives. And here I'm relying on Paul's work. Gulnaz Sharafuddinova and the anthropologist Arhipova out of Russia are also doing narratives. I've only heard her talk about this work. I haven't seen it written up yet. We are seeing a rise and fall of narrative. Why it's falling, why the Nazism narrative appears to be, the state appears to be abandoning it or de-stressing it, I think it's very hard for me to say. I'm really reluctant to go too far into that ground. I do think we're going to see a little, well, you're following it as well, Helga, May 9th claim that having taken Mariupol, they've defeated Nazism, right, in this narrow sense. But I think we just need to know more. I wish I could say.
Yeah, we need a little bit more time before we can.
Oh, we do. I think we're
give
all
good
quite
answers here.
overwhelmed now, right? We're trying to keep.
But we have more questions, so let's keep firing.
Hi, I'm Guri Tillum, working at FAFO here in Oslo. Thank you for a very interesting talk. So many thought-provoking ideas. I would like to go back to some of the analysis that you presented from the survey, and in particular the one where you showed the conservative values and the correlation between conservative values and support for popular support. And I've been sitting here thinking, what does that mean? Because it cannot mean, can it, that the popular support for protests is actually coming from the right of Putin? Is it the right-wing movements that are actually protesting? And probably what it does mean, I don't know, but I've been thinking, does it mean that it's the leftists or the less conservative people are still frightened to actually participate? And that can also explain why you don't find people with higher education supporting this. So the support that you're finding actually now is from within, in a way, or maybe even to the right of Putin, of popular support. But you don't really see a strong popular support for protests to the left yet. Am I right? Or do you...
Well, I think it's a little more complicated. I think, first of all, that these family values that we have in the survey that are linked to a sort of more conservative overview are values that push people to engage in the kind of, in the Shaes protest, or there's a very nice paper coming out, I think, in Russian politics or East European politics about the use of conservative narratives in Shaes, in these traditional value touchstones. So I think, for example, one of the most active protesting populations are mothers who have been promised benefits from the state in these maternal health care benefits and don't get them, either housing or other things, or the variation in maternal health care benefits across regions creates discontent. Two regions right next to each other often have very different maternal benefits packages. So I think there is a protest constituency around health and environment and government accountability that comes from these family-oriented, family values folks. I think that's a real thing. I started working with the left-right scale in the survey, and to get the answer to your question, there is actually some significant left protest emerging in our volume that we did. Again, Jeremy Morris's work on the organization of food deliverers is a left-based kind of protest. There's a leftist ideology in Russia that is emerging. If you mean more liberal ideology, then I think we saw disengagement in this survey, given the timing. But these are also the people most likely to be offended by the normal country argument, right? And so that's why I think the picture is very complex. There is a before the war and after the war picture. And as a social scientist, I can't give you the kind of answer I would like to. But I do think it's a complicated picture.
Okay, we have time for, well, we have 2 more questions. So first, let's take both of them now. We'll start with Karsten.
Thank you. My name is Karsten Friis. I work here at NUPI. I'm sorry I came a bit late, so if you already addressed it. I reading the news that lots of people are leaving Russia, and the typical everything by led answer to IT geeks. And to me, that's like the educated, typical people that be kind of pushing for demonstrations and things like that. So I don't know if we have any numbers on that, but is that, again, to speculate, is that a number that could impact the potential, you think? Brain drain.
Let's also take the final question right away.
Thank you. Toby from the University of Oslo. Actually, very good question. I was thinking the same, because unlike in the Soviet Union, people are actually allowed to leave. Many people I know who are against the regime, they have already left Russia for other countries, from Turkey to Georgia and so on. My question is, I think the authorities is trying to contain this more and more. And just 1 week after the invasion, they introduced the law on fakes, also known as the law of military censorship. They banned Twitter, Facebook, a lot of other websites, and they are continuing to do so through Roskomnadzor. I think new technology is also not only enabling the protest movement, but also the authorities. With facial recognition all over Moscow, St. Petersburg, they will, if you are a target person they're looking for, they will potentially, find you in just seconds if you are one of their targets. And also with the cell phones, they will be able to monitor like a big group of gathering if something irregular is happening. So I think this is in many ways enabling the regime to contain any future protest, as long as it's the Putin. And Putin has said that he will never allow a color revolution. So I think under his regime, and in general, we see also an approachment towards China. Just 3 weeks ahead of the invasion, Putin was in Beijing with a new strategic partnership with China, and we know how China is dealing with protest movements and with their way of controlling society. So my question is, do you think it's the possibility that under the Putin regime, or under, will they manage to contain this?
2 very good questions to wrap up the seminar.
That was like 7 questions.
Okay, 7 questions to wrap up the seminar in 2 minutes.
Okay, so fingers crossed, we just put in a grant to try to do some interviews within this diaspora community to understand it a little better. I do think that it's a very mixed diaspora. So some people are leaving for economic reasons. Other people are leaving because they're under threat of being arrested or had been charged in the initial protests. Margarita Savatskaya and her students have done already some online interviews of diaspora. We learned that 50% of them have been threatened by the authorities in some way. So I think it does, in some ways, impact protest potential. But again, it's large by what we expect. It's not large by Russia's population. There's still a huge population of people there. People are doing amazingly brave things in Russia and standing up to the authorities. And they're already launching investigations into, for example, the maltreatment of women who have been arrested. So people are doing so from social scientists to journalists to activists to NGO folks. One big place where I'm most concerned in the diaspora is that I think it's also decapitating social NGOs. And I think that's a big problem. And whether or not there are people behind them from these protesters, these discontent folks who then move into NGO sector, is a really interesting question. But this is something we're keeping, I think we all need to keep our eye on. So I want to say Russia's not China. You overestimate, when you compare Russia and China, you overestimate Russian technological capacity. We have already seen this with the military. The top 10 apps downloaded in the wake of the war are all VPNs, so let's all be careful about how much we say. I do think that these draconian laws certainly tamp down protest, and it means that some things have to happen for a mass mobilization. One is that some cities need, and police forces need to demonstrate that they're not going to respond in a repressive way, and it's very difficult to understand what the likelihood of that will be, given militarization of the police, special treatment of the police. I don't think it's impossible, particularly given the use of policing forces in this war in such an inept way, and also the solidarity of many of these folks in the police with military forces, right? So we'll see how that unfolds. But certainly the cost of activism is extraordinarily high right now. If it happens, it will happen quickly. It will happen really, really fast, and it will find a lot of support within the government, right? Because we know that there's opposition within the government, in all branches of the government. So that's a very explosive situation. Let me go back to where I started. Protest in any country is a rare event. For individuals to protest in Russia, for us to get numbers that look like this, that's a very high level of discontent. And whether this war is a reset or not is I suspect it is not. I've been arguing it is not an entire reset, but it is a shock. And how it shakes out, I think, is the question on the table.
So obviously we don't have all the answers yet. We have the questions, but not the answers. But we will continue working on this project on values-based authoritarian legitimation for another couple of years. And as I said at the start of the seminar, we organized this seminar series on a annual base. So we will be back after the summer with a new seminar, and that next time we will have Henry Hale presenting. So stay tuned, but as for now, please join me in giving a big hand and thank Regina for her presentation here today.